Lecture 24, The Catholic Church in the USA. In this concluding lecture, you will be introduced to the history of the Catholic Church in the United States of America. We will begin with the Spanish and French, who were first responsible for bringing Catholicism to the New World. This will be followed by a section on Catholicism during the American-British colonial and post-revolutionary eras, with a focus on Maryland. Finally, the development of Catholicism during and after the birth of the U.S. will be presented. Spanish and French colonies. On April 2nd, 1513, the Spanish became the first Europeans to set foot on what is today Florida. The head of the expedition was the Catholic Juan Ponce de Leon. He was responsible for giving the name Florida to this land. He did so because when he landed in Florida, Catholics were celebrating Easter, which, among other titles, the Spanish call Pascua Florida, Festival of Flowers, since the opening of flowers well represents the rising of Christ. Shortly after, another Spanish expedition arrived in 1559. Under the command of Don Tristan de Luna y Arellano, the first Catholic Mass was celebrated on August 15th, the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, in Pensacola, Florida, by Dominican friars at St. Michael the Archangel's Church, now the Basilica of St. Michael the Archangel. In 1565, the Spanish founded the first permanent European and Catholic settlement in the New World. The Spanish later also established settlements in the western side of the New World in lands now known as Texas, New Mexico, and California. The Spanish Franciscan St. Junipero Serra was responsible for founding 21 Californian missions, including the following sites, now modern-day cities: Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego, and Santa Clara. The following century, in 1699, the French Catholics established the French colony of Louisiana, which is not to be confused with the U.S. state called Louisiana. This French territory was named after the reigning French king Louis XIV. At one point, French Louisiana extended roughly from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico and from the Rocky Mountains to the Appalachian Mountains. In 1803, Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte sold French Louisiana to the United States. American, British colonialism, and post-revolutionary era. Profit-based Protestant colonies. We now turn our attention to the British and mainly Protestant regions of the New World that are depicted up in the maps provided in this transcript as spanning the east coast from Acadia, French Louisiana, or New France to the Spanish-controlled Florida. After the failed attempt under Queen Elizabeth to establish in the late 1500s a colony off the coast of the modern state of Carolina on an island formerly dubbed the Roanoke Island, the British finally established a colony in early 1600s named Jamestown in modern-day Virginia. The purpose of this settlement was not religiously oriented, as would later settlements be north in modern-day New England. Instead, Jamestown was founded for imperial and financial reasons by a corporation that had obtained a charter from the English King James I, hence the name Jamestown. One seldom referred to purpose of this settlement was for it to serve as a base from which the Protestant British Empire could raid ships of Catholic Spain known for carrying gold. Under the previous Protestant monarch, Queen Elizabeth I, piracy against Catholic Spain had become sanctioned. The 1588 invasion of England by the Spanish Armada, which failed, was in part caused by the English piracy of Spanish ships. Religiously based Protestant colonies. Unlike the southern colony of Jamestown, the northern colonies were founded not primarily out of hope for profit and expansion of the British Empire, but rather out of desire to live a form of Calvinistic Protestantism now known as Puritanism. The Puritans had fled England, which they had deemed as overly Catholic with its high liturgies and a retainment of the office of bishop. To leave England discreetly, in the 1600s a group of Puritans founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony, a company, complete with a corporate board of directors. After arriving in Massachusetts, they then converted their company into a province, their board of directors into a legislative body, and the corporate head, John Winthrop, into their governor. Another group of puritanical Protestants, named in the 18th century as the Pilgrims, fled England in the Mayflower ship and sought refuge near the Massachusetts Bay. They named their Protestant colony the Plymouth Colony. Religiously based colony of Maryland. Not only Puritans, but also English Catholics left England to avoid persecution. Between 1634 and 1776, Catholics from England set up Catholic-friendly settlements in the colonies Maryland and Pennsylvania. The Catholic convert George Calvert played a key role in establishing a Catholic settlement in Maryland. In 1619, George Calvert was appointed by Charles I of England as one of two secretaries of state. Charles I's predecessor, King James I, granted George Calvert a 2,300-acre estate in County Longford, Ireland, the Manor of Baltimore. In 1625, George Calvert resigned his service to the king and around the same time converted from Anglicanism to Catholicism. In 1629, after having already set up a settlement of Avalon in Newfoundland, off the coast of modern-day Canada, George Calvert arrived in Jamestown. The Puritans there insisted that he leaves, which he did. Finally, in 1632, George Calvert and Lord Baltimore was granted by King Charles I a royal charter to settle in the colony of Maryland. He died, though, before the charter was sealed. His son, Cecil Calvert, continued his father's mission by obtaining in 1633 a charter from King Charles I and then by setting sail to Maryland. In 1634, Cecil Calvert's two ships, the Ark and the Dove, landed in Maryland. The passengers included Protestants, Catholic laity, 3 Jesuit priests, and Calvert's brother Leonard, who became the governor of Maryland. Not surprisingly, due to its religious mix, out of Maryland developed the U.S. concept of religious liberty, the freedom to choose one religion, and separation of church and state. This was demonstrated in law as early as 1649, when Maryland's Assembly issued a Religious Toleration Act for Christians. The religious toleration of Catholics by Puritans only lasted by law up until 1654, when the Maryland Assembly, dominated by Puritans, excluded Catholics from general toleration by politically restricting them. Catholic prejudice subsided during the American War of Independence, 1775 to 1783, when Catholics demonstrated their loyalty to the colonies. One of the most significant Catholics was Charles Carroll III, a signer on the Declaration of Independence. According to Carroll, he signed the Declaration to support, and I quote, "not only our independence of England, but the toleration of all sects professing the Christian religion." When in 1778 France allied itself with the Americans against the British, the association of Catholicism with France also helped to reduce prejudice against Catholics. The acceptance of Catholicism in the United States. Charles Carroll III's cousin, John Carroll, also played a central role in the acceptance of Catholicism in the U.S. In 1789, John Carroll was elected as the first U.S. bishop of a diocese, Baltimore, that later in 1808 would be recognized by Rome as an archdiocese. Under his leadership, the Catholic Church became more established in the United States by the founding of Georgetown, the erection of 3 seminaries, and a number of colleges and academies for the laity, and the expansion and founding of various religious orders. Near the turn of the 18th century and the latter portion of John Carroll's episcopacy, anti-Catholic sentiment began to increase as immigrants from Ireland began steadily coming to the U.S. U.S. anti-Catholicism. Fear of Catholics was expressed in 1834 in a terrifying manner when an unruly mob set fire to an Ursuline convent in Charlestown, Massachusetts. The mob was encouraged by the U.S. nativist movement, which held that Catholics were destroying the U.S. with their immorality. During the 1830s, Maria Monk, capitalizing on anti-Catholic hysteria, published her popular, virulently anti-Catholic book, Awful Disclosures of the Hôtel Dieu Nunnery in Montreal. In her book, she depicts nuns as sex slaves of the clergy, who had their infants baptized and then killed. People who were deeply suspicious of the Catholic Church not only included the U.S. nativist movement and novelists like Maria Monk, but also were highly influential office holders, specifically the second and third president of the U.S., John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. John Adams, second president of the U.S., even questioned in a May 19, 1821 letter to Thomas Jefferson, and I quote, "Can a free government possibly exist with the Catholic religion?" The third U.S. president, Thomas Jefferson, similarly stated, and I quote, "History, I believe, furnishes no example of a priest-ridden people maintaining a free civil government." Jefferson also asserted in his March 17, 1814 letter to Horatio G. Spafford that, and I quote, "In every country and in every age, the priest has been hostile to liberty. He is always in alliance with the despot, abetting his abuses in return for protection to his own." Another war, the American Civil War, would once again help to convince Protestant U.S. citizens that Catholics were not a threat to national unity. Protestants witnessed Catholic sisters and priests heroically tending to the wounded and dying, and Catholic men fighting for either the North or the South. As Sean Fabian explains, the U.S. bishops were instrumental during the Civil War in quenching anti-Catholic sentiment by carefully not taking sides. And I quote from Sean, "The hierarchy of the Church in America saw the turmoil, the American Civil War, 1861 to 1865, as an opportunity to promote acceptance for Catholicism by undermining the prejudices against it, thereby establishing it as a genuinely American faith. The bishops' plan to execute this change relied mostly on example. In the North, they flew the U.S. flag at cathedrals, and in the South, they altered prayers to reflect their Confederate allegiance. Further, the bishops knew that a large Catholic element in the armies, one that carried itself with dignity and performed well, would do much to help Catholics gain a place in America, and they urged all enlisted Catholics to fight with courage and honor so as to reflect well upon their faith." End of quote. In the 1920s, anti-Catholicism once again was promoted, with the Ku Klux Klan along with the Scottish Rite Masons leading the way. Catholics, respectful of the democratic process, fought back and successfully won a key court case, Pierce versus the Society of Sisters, 1925. In this case, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that Oregon's Compulsory Education Act that prohibited Catholic schools was unconstitutional. This victory did not deter anti-Catholics from obtaining high offices. The Alabama state senator, Hugo Black, was able to gain votes by speaking at KKK gatherings, where he repeatedly condemned Catholicism. In 1937, Hugo Black was appointed an Associate Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, an office he held until 1971. Yet another war, World War II, where Catholics fought side by side with Protestants and other believers and non-believers, once again greatly helped to decrease anti-Catholic sentiment. The Cold War that followed World War II, with its pronounced anti-communism in the U.S., spearheaded by the Wisconsin Republican Senator Joseph McCarthy, also helped to displace anti-Catholicism. Verification that Catholics had been accepted nationwide with little suspicion took place during the 1960s presidential election, when the Catholic John F. Kennedy emerged as the winner. Less than 40 years earlier, in 1928, the Catholic presidential Democratic candidate Al Smith lost to the Republican Herbert Hoover, in part due to the Republicans' use of anti-Catholicism as a way to take votes away from Smith. At that time, many voters feared that if Al Smith won, he would be beholden to the Pope. In order to alleviate a similar fear, John F. Kennedy told his countrymen, and I quote, "I am not the Catholic candidate for president. I'm the Democratic Party's candidate for president who also happens to be a Catholic. I do not speak for my church on public matters, and the church does not speak for me. Whatever issue may come before me as president, on birth control, divorce, censorship, gambling, or any other subject, I will make my decision in accordance with these views, in accordance with what my conscience tells me to be the national interest, and without regard to outside religious pressures or dictates. And no power or threat of punishment could cause me to decide otherwise." End of quote. Do you find this excerpt from John F. Kennedy's speech problematic? Why or why not? Catholic sanctity amidst U.S. anti-Catholicism. Since sanctity is one of the most persuasive factors in convincing people of the goodness of Catholicism, we will conclude this lecture and this book by looking at three great U.S. saints: the first U.S. citizen saint, the first U.S. native-born saint, and the first U.S. man to be canonized. Keep in mind that all three of the saints lived in a time when anti-Catholic sentiment was prevalent in the U.S., as briefly described in the previous section. St. Francis Xavier Cabrini. The first U.S. citizen, but not native-born citizen, to be canonized was St. Francis Xavier Cabrini, lived from 1850 and died in 1917. St. Francis Cabrini was born to an Italian farming family at Sant'Angelo Lodigiano. Desiring in her 20s to join a religious congregation, she applied to two: the Daughters of the Sacred Heart and the Canossian Sisters. Due to her poor health, both congregations rejected her application. Not deterred, she followed an inspiration to found her own religious community of Catholic missionaries, something unusual at that time, since at that time men had been Catholic missionaries, not women. In 1880, her rule of life for her Missionaries of the Sacred Heart community was accepted. Then, in 1887, after she traveled to Rome for papal approval, her institute was approved at the highest ecclesial level. Since the U.S. was still considered a missionary country, her first mission was to the United States, with special attention to be given to Italian immigrants. In 1889, she and 6 of her sisters arrived by ship in New York. Strangely, the New York Archbishop, who wanted priests and not women religious, told St. Francis Cabrini to return to Italy, since he had no need of her. She responded by informing him that she had approval from the Pope and, therefore, intended to stay, which she did. In New York, St. Francis Cabrini and her sisters set about surviving by finding shelter and begging for money. Eventually, they were able to meet not only their needs, but also of many poor Italian immigrants by feeding their hungry, teaching their children, and caring for their sick. St. Francis Cabrini used her ability to raise funds and win over people's trust by establishing orphanages and even a hospital, the Columbus Hospital. After her missionary work was fairly well established in the United States, Pope Leo XIII requested that she hurry all over the earth if possible in order to take the holy name of Jesus everywhere. Heeding the Holy Father's request, St. Cabrini began evangelizing Central America and then South America. On December 22, 1917, this great female missionary saint died in the hospital she had founded, the Columbus Hospital, while wrapping up presents for children. St. Elizabeth Ann Bailey Seton. The first native-born U.S. citizen to be canonized was St. Elizabeth Ann Bailey Seton. Was born in 1774 and died in 1821. St. Elizabeth Ann Seton was born into a prominent New York Protestant family and raised according to her mother's Episcopalian religion. When 20, she married a shipping merchant, William Magus Seton, and with him had 5 children. Tragedy struck the Seton family when William's shipping business went bankrupt. The bankruptcy was followed by yet another tragedy when William contracted tuberculosis, traveled with his wife to Italy for respite, and there died. While in Italy, grieving over her beloved husband's death, St. Elizabeth was drawn to the Catholic Church. Upon returning to the U.S., she requested instruction in the faith and was received into the Catholic Church in 1805. After her conversion, many of her friends and acquaintances stopped supporting her. She was able to make ends meet by teaching. In the midst of these trying times, she followed a call deep within her heart to found a religious community. In 1809, the previously mentioned Archbishop of Baltimore, John Carroll, approved her request to take religious vows and begin a new religious community, the Sisters of St. Joseph. Her community began specializing in teaching and caring for orphans. St. John Neumann, 1811 to 1860. The first U.S. man to be canonized was St. John Neumann, Redemptorist. In his native country of Bohemia, St. John Neumann felt called to the priesthood and entered in the Czech Budweis Seminary. 4 years later, after completing nearly all the requirements to be ordained a priest, the bishop of St. John Neumann's diocese canceled priestly ordinations for that year, since the bishop thought his diocese did not need any more priests. Not unduly discouraged, St. John Neumann then traveled to the U.S. and New York, and that same year was accepted by the New York bishop and ordained to the priesthood. After ministering for 4 years in the New York diocese, St. John Neumann felt called to the religious life and applied to the Redemptorist order. He was accepted, and in 1842 he took his vows. His superiors quickly noticed his extraordinary Christian leadership abilities and appointed him vicar of all U.S. Redemptorists. In 1852, he was once again asked to lead in yet another position, that of Bishop of Philadelphia. And I want to conclude with a little excerpt from St. John Neumann's letter to the Holy See. It's an example of his great humility and obedience. I am indeed prepared either to remain in the same condition in which I am present, and that would be being a bishop, or if God so inspires His Holiness, the Pope, to give the whole administration of the diocese to the Most Reverend James Wood. I am equally prepared to resign from the episcopate and to go where I may more securely prepare myself for death and for the account which must be rendered to the divine justice. I desire nothing but to fulfill the wish of the Holy Father, whatever it may be. God bless.